welcome to the Hollow Path. And welcome to this evening's guest, Amelia Hogan. Hello, Amelia, how are you?
Hello, I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Very well, and delighted to be hosting you on this podcast this evening. I actually appeared on your podcast at one point, so I've already got into that thing of just, podcasters inviting each other onto their podcasts, which is fantastic. Though Amelia is much more infamous, not as a podcaster, but rather as an artist and musician. Amelia has released herself and appeared on several albums, including the very current Taking Flight, which is currently doing exactly what it says on the tin and taking flight into the folk charts all over the world. I was sort of around during the genesis of the album, in the sense that I was keeping up with what was going on, and Amelia's incredible efforts to put this album together with amazing musicians, concentrating mainly on, I would say, quite Irish folk, but with other influences as well. And it has been an absolute pleasure to listen to this wonderful, enchanting music and to see it meeting with the success that it deserves. So, Amelia, how does it feel to be riding high in the charts?
I'm super excited for it. I'm delighted, honored, amazed in some ways, right? To reach Billboard charts in any capacity at all is sort of a big deal, and to be riding high in them is sort of like, wow, little old me. But I also, I have to thank world-class musicians for saying yes to working with me on the project, and artists of various sorts, right? Our mutual friend, Mikhail Yagupov, as major clanger on the Book of Faces, did some beautiful photographs and said yes to letting me use them on the inside of the booklet. And my friend Venee, Call-Ferrer, had some wonderful sessions with me out in the graveyard, out in the old churchyard in the Bay Area. So, I got to work with brilliant people, which everybody's lifted when that happens. So
Absolutely, I think it's one of the best ways to make good work. And I love, you're a singer in a sense. You're a solo singer, but you always do, in this and in your other endeavors, have this attitude of, working with people and bringing people together and seeing what that alchemy is that happens when you put different people in a room together. And I absolutely love the musical styles that you've got on the album, and your take on, you say on your website that your vocal style is very influenced by sean-nós, which is the Irish old style singing, which definitely comes through. But then there's also, I don't think what you're trying to do is just reproduce exactly the old style. It's very much a take on it, and it's very much taking different influences and making them into something new. But for me, it absolutely captures that very particular haunting magic that the best of Irish folk and trad has. Which brings me to my first big question. And this is, I'm testing this as my opening question for people after I introduce them, which is, what is your relationship to magic?
That's a lovely question. I think my relationship to it is that it's threaded through my awareness of my life and my life force and my being embodied on this earth at this time and place. If I'm paying attention to the changes and movements and subtleties of other beings in the spaces I co-occupy, then I'm in conversation with all of them. And it's a negotiation. Like, my magic in that is a negotiation between my life force and their life forces.
That's really interesting. So it seems like, the first thing that comes to mind is this idea of relationship and connection. It's not, when you say my magic, it's all about how you exist in the space, in the world, in embodiment, and in relation to those other places, people, persons, all around us, in whatever form they take. I think that's lovely. So I think that it's interesting to me, and this is my theme. This is what I've chosen, is art and magic. And I think we hear people talk a lot about, what is art or what is magic, and of course much ink has been spilled and much hot air emitted on the subject of one's relationship to art, etc. But the relationship between the two of them, not quite as much. Let me ask you this.
Sure.
Why is music the most magical of all the arts?
I think it reaches people on a limbic level. There's a wonderful book by a neuroscientist named Dr. Daniel Levitin, which was This Is Your Brain on Music, right?
Lovely, yeah.
And what he's doing is he's showing what happens neurochemically in the brains of people, mammals in general, and specifically musicians, when they are both playing and listening to music. And for musicians, every single part of your brain is active when you are listening to music.
Oh, wow.
So you can't help but be moved and changed by music if you are already engaged in making it at some level yourself in some other way. Your kinetic senses, your oral senses, your language and symbolism, memory, consequence, storytelling, all parts of your brain are active. And part of why that's possible is that it's like it's its own living thing. It's a very animist approach. So if you're a musician, you're already engaged in conversation with this living entity or being or concept or egregore even.
Which is the music?
Which is the music.
Ooh, interesting. So, I love that. So, and I actually, and I love the way that you went from neurochemistry and limbic systems and kinetic senses, and you're like, so that's animism, right? No, but it's great because the thing is, I think that sometimes we have a tendency, and I have a tendency even, if you ask me to describe sort of the magical qualities of a particular art form or whatever, I'm going to start talking in a very woolly way, so it's really nice to hear about, like, here's some neuroscience, right? But how interesting that you continue this theme of, so when you engage with music, that's a relationship.
Yes.
Right? You're not just producing something. It's you in conversation with this other, which is the music.
If I do my job right, and I share my relationship with other people and listeners, I'm inviting them to have their own conversations with this thing that I'm sharing with them, this entity, or
it becomes a kind of a three-way, if you will. No, sorry, what? No, but so you mean that when the musician or the person who is performing the music their conversation with the music itself is potentially is a dialogue. Like it's a back and forth, or it's two entities in relation. And then the audience, you're inviting them not only to witness your dialogue, but to enter into their own relationship with the sort of the sum of what you've created, with the kind of the gestalt of you and the music becomes a thing, and then each audience member, and then all audience members, because I think that's true too, isn't it? It's different listening to music on your own and listening to music in a group.
It is, and the same thing is true of conversations, right? It's the same thing when a new person walks into a party.
Right. That's true, but I mean, I think there's a conversation's not a performance, though.
No, but it's like I'm a host for the conversation.
Okay, I got you. Like, so the performer isn't just presenting something on the stage, but rather they are inviting people into a group experience, into a milieu, into a group conversation.
Yeah. I think that's how I view my role as an artist. I've been to concerts where it's much more, the music is about me, so you should love me because I'm sort of performing at you. It's not even to or with or.
I think we've all been to those concerts, you know? And
Right.
I think especially when we have a couple of things, like especially when you've got like a kind of a star performer, like the kind of the rock star type thing, they're like asking for adulation. But even when you've got something like a classical concert or something, which is performed with everyone's very solemn, you know, and it's like very, very reverent, you know, this is the music and this is the person who is kind of the almost like a priest of that music, performing a religious ritual, and everyone has their head bowed and they're very, very concentrated. And it doesn't seem to invite much response. Like, you know, you're not allowed to clap until the very, very end. You know,
Yeah.
nothing to break the sacred silence, right? In which only the music. But what you're talking about is that lovely other thing where you're in a performance situation. I don't know. I want to say a session, you know, a
More
session
like
in
a, it is very much more like a session. If I'm, and bigger halls and stages and things, I still look for conversations with both other musicians and with the people I'm in the room with.
yeah,
Like, there's no part of my magical spiritual brain that says the whole of the context is irrelevant. Because every single time I'm singing a song, it's going to be colored by the weather, the temperature, my mood,
mm,
the structure of the sound in that space. If it's a bar, if it's a house concert, if it's a hall, a community hall or center or theater, it's going to be changed. My music is going to be changed because it's alive in the place that it's in. It's going to have been a different moment. So no matter how repeat the technicalities, the colors of it are going to be subtly different each time.
absolutely. And it's not just a question of acoustics, but absolutely a question of the fact that I think, you know, a good performer is always reading the room. And so you can actually feel, even hear people's reactions. Like you can hear, for example, you know, I bet you this is something that you have experienced in your own performance. But if you're in a crowded pub where everyone's chatting and drinking, there's that one performer, and I bet you've been it, who starts singing a song that is quiet, and suddenly the silence spreads out from the person singing, and everyone shuts up.
I love those moments.
Right? And that nobody told them to be quiet. It's that they heard the little circle of silence that suddenly appeared around the performer when this quiet, beautiful song began. And they stopped to listen and it spread. And I mean, that's like an anti-sound, you know? the sound of the spread of silence, right? Or you hear people who hear a funny line and laugh, or people who cheer when they hear a good bit, you know? I love a concert where people are reacting all the time,
Mm-hmm.
you know? I mean, there's, you know, I know that you've played, I mean, you're based in Northern California, San Francisco, and you've played all over the United States, you've played all over Europe, and you've played in some of the most prestigious venues in Ireland, which are obviously the most prestigious of all the ones I just mentioned. But you know the way when you play in Ireland, especially when you're playing folk and trad music, there's a lot of people that seem to think you need encouragement all the time, and they're like, "Ah, go on, yeah, oh, go on, aye, oh, you know, up, yeah, up." You know, they're sort of given these little, as if it's only their sort of cheerleading that is going to get this effort over the top, you know. But it's lovely. It's lovely, especially when when it's quite, you know, obviously it can be misplaced, but if you've got a lively kind of jigs and reels kind of thing going on, like people will kind of spontaneously give little shouts and cheers and claps of encouragement and stamp their feet and shake their heads, and you know, and I think then that feedback, that instant feedback from the audience, must feed the way that you're playing and singing.
Of course it does. Because again, you're meeting them where they are. A big misconception, I think, about performing arts is that reading the room is important, but listening to the room and to that space, to create the space so that this living thing can breathe.
Yeah.
So that, right, a friend of mine who teaches sean-nós did a lot of academic study in Belfast and Dublin in the 70s and 80s, likes to say that, you know, putting a metric time signature on a lot of the songs is like putting a straitjacket on someone.
Yeah.
If you're constantly thinking of the music as alive and as a living entity, you're going to treat its story and its words and its concepts and its heart very differently.
Yeah. I mean,
And it's funny, I'd never thought of myself as a sean-nós singer, except that people keep telling me that that's what I'm bringing to it, is that quiet intensity.
yeah, yeah. Maybe you could tell us, because you know some people might not know what is sean-nós. Like the words themselves, they mean the old style or the old tradition. Um, what is sean-nós singing in Ireland, and how has it traveled? Perhaps. I mean, that's interesting too. But what is sean-nós originally?
It's a way of saying a story or a song such that each moment that requires extra emphasis and consideration is heard carefully. Each
Mm,
moment that requires a little bit more grace and space around it has that ornamentation and grace and space.
mm.
It's a way of being in partnership with the song that is listening to it while you're sharing it.
Oh yeah, wow, yeah,
Um, so often instructors will say, oh, it's songs in Irish. Well, Oro Shirawahawalia is a song that's not sean-nós. It's in Irish,
mm,
but it can be done in a sean-nós way
mm,
if you're giving it space to breathe and live and change and move with each telling of it, each singing of it, each
right.
verse of it, right?
Okay, now that's fascinating, because and the other thing that people might not know is that typically sean-nós is sung by one person, unaccompanied, a cappella, and maybe not always, but that's what we imagine when we think of a sean-nós singing. And it's lovely that you use that word grace around it, because it's sort of one of the things that people tend to notice about it is the inclusion of grace notes, and that they may vary from performance to performance, as you say. But I love the way that, as you describe it, it sounds like to sing sean-nós is to sing in exactly that way that you've been describing, which is the treating the song like a living entity, that you are not performing off a hymn sheet, you're not performing a sort of a set thing, but you're rather engaging with a being, and you are treating them with the respect they deserve in that moment. They might not be in the same mood as they always are, or, you know, it's like you're having a conversation, just like you've been talking about, which may
Mhm.
vary perhaps from time to time. You won't perform the same song the same way, right?
And you should, right? Like, a whole life isn't stagnant or, static. A whole
Yeah.
life is comprised of moments of, like, your kids have moods, your parents have moods, you have moods in your teenage years, and one day you're
I
gonna
still
be
do. What are you talking about?
right? One day we're gonna be entirely joy-filled and elated at the attention of the classmate next to us, and the next day we're just gonna be entirely irritated that they
Mm,
exist in our mental spaces at all. Um, there are moments for everything, and there are moments for different kinds of magic, and you have to be willing and able to listen for what's appropriate in this moment. So when people at a party say, do one of your songs," I'm like, okay, I'm gonna pull out a party piece, which is like, it's not a Shannos piece. That's not the right context for this. That's not honoring the music or the
yeah.
listeners, unless it is.
Because you might say, okay, you know what, I'm going to do this. Like you just might, yeah. But you have to judge. You have to judge it very finely. And I know that whenever I have had the privilege of hearing a Shano singer live, um, it is absolutely spellbinding, because often these are songs that have a sort of a very deeply emotional, deeply, I don't want to be cliched, but like often melancholy. Often there's a kind of a sadness. There's a kind of a even pain that can be expressed in that way. Um, and when you see when you see someone singing one of these songs, they will often look completely rapt, enraptured in what they are doing, almost as if at that moment they're in communion with the song. And now, contrary perhaps to what you were saying, they will have judged whether or not to sing the song right now. But once they go in there,
They're in.
they're in, and they become almost oblivious to everything around them, because they are in a moment of communion, almost trance, I want to say.
Yeah.
And that, to me, seems to speak to a role for the singer and a role for the poet, that is much deeper and older than what we typically experience today. Um,
Can
I mean,
I
go on.
The thing about a singular thread of melody
Mm,
is that it requires the listener to work, to focus, to be present with the specific phrasing and space around the
yeah,
phrasing. It requires an intention and attention to be in communion with that music.
yeah,
And that's part of why you choose your moments to share Shannos very differently from a generic qua concert.
yeah,
Why you might build a set so that it leads people from song to song to song until they have the mental space around which they can focus on and really dive in with you into that song with you. And if I do my job right, I'm getting away in the out of the way of their communion with that
right.
feeling, with that emotional space that I've brought them into.
So let me ask you this. You know, I was speculating that the Shano singer in that moment is in a very private moment of like almost trance-like communion. But it strikes me that what you're saying now is yes, but they are also providing that for the audience, and in that sense, they're becoming like a conduit, like channeling the song, right?
Yeah.
They are channeling the spirit of that song in order to offer to the audience that moment of communion.
Yeah. There's a
And
very priesting work.
yes, yes. And so that, and that's where I was kind of going with that, was I was saying, like, this role of the singer or the bard strikes me as sacramental, and um, as having that sort of almost channeling trance work type thing that we might be tempted to call shamanic. And that those things in Ireland, those were specifically and explicitly roles attributed to the bard or the file in the early Gaelic culture. And it seems like, yeah, that is a type of magic. Now, of course, it exists in many, many cultures around the world, but this is our one. And that when you do that, there is this sort of like holy aspect and kind of sacred role that you're playing to your community.
Yes, I would agree with that. I'm never as pleased with the work that I have done to create that space as when I'm hearing people sort of spill out all of the emotional spaces they went to, all of their life stories, their children's stories, their grandmother from way back when. And this happens
Mm.
almost every time after a show or a session or a moment where people don't know if they're allowed to speak again. But
Yeah,
it's not about pomposity or seriousness,
yeah,
or I mean, it is serious, but it's not solemn. And I think a lot of American audiences and a lot of mainland European audiences mistake solemnity for seriousness or
vice versa.
sacredness.
Yes, yes. You
That's
mean
where
that?
you get the weird
You mean,
symphony.
yeah. So you mean that, like, they will engage in a sort of a solemn moment or a solemn practice, and they will think that therefore I'm doing something serious and I'm a serious person, kind of thing. Whereas that's not actually quite what we're talking about.
Or even vice versa. They'll
Yeah.
think, "I have to put my fancy duds on and
Mm.
my black tie and my nice clothes and stuff," and they're sitting there scowling, they're not listening to the music at all.
No.
They're there to be seen, they're there to feel pompous and special and all of that, but they're not moved.
Mm.
They're not allowed to move. They're not allowed to respond to a joyful part or giggle at this great flight of the bumblebee moment where the fiddle is just doing this intense buzzing kind of like,
I
if
know
you're
it. Yeah.
yeah,
And actually, it's like when you hear it, like, it goes on and it's kind of a little bit funny, and then it keeps going and it keeps going, and like you have to laugh. Like, it is a joke. Like, it's supposed to be funny, it's supposed to be like intolerably funny. But I
that's why
absolutely,
it's sacred though.
yes, yes. And so, and this is something else then, perhaps, is that you're talking about um that reaction that people have of, like, this spilling of emotion. And I mean, that's one thing, because, like, you will, this happens, and I know you've seen this. Like, it will make people cry, or it'll make people laugh, or it'll make people gasp, all these things. But of all those things, like, laughter's in there too. Laughter also is one of those physical, like, upsurges of feeling, you know? It's not quite as, it's not sophisticated. We're not talking about emotions. We're talking like crying, screaming, laughing, gasping. All of those are the gut things, They're like,
Right.
they're feelings, right? They're not things that they're in your body. You don't think about them. They're like reaction, they're gut reactions. But then that other reaction you say afterwards is very interesting. It causes people to tell you stories. Now, what's that about? And I think I'm thinking about the idea of catharsis here.
You've broken the tension and the container's edges of the facade that they carry around with them about their emotional landscapes and their ups and downs and their way of being in the world. But in those moments that you draw them out of themselves and into the song or story
Mm,
with you, if you're, as I say, if you're doing it right, you're feeling it and in communion strong enough and fully enough and deeply enough for yourself
yeah,
that in that moment of ecstasis for yourself with the song, that tension that's carried gets a release when they get to step out of themselves for that moment and be
yes,
transformed by the music and
yeah,
remind themselves of what they already feel. It just gives them a place to put it.
exactly. And now I think it's fascinating to me because I think I told this anecdote to you before, but I'm thinking about when you tell me that and about people coming to you to tell you about these feelings and these stories and these tales of their family histories and their loves and losses and stuff. Um, I'm thinking about that kind of immigrant experience. Like you see this you're an American when you bring Irish music, especially to an audience who has some Irish heritage, um, that they will want to tell you about their connection to Ireland. And it might be something that they're not like often, going around talking about, it might be like, um, these might be sad stories, or these might be things that they feel a bit diffident about claiming, because, it's 3 generations, 4 generations, 5 generations ago. But I bet you people come up to you and say, my great great grandfather was from County Mayo, you know, and they just want you to hear it. They just want you to acknowledge their connection.
I think people create a kind of legitimacy around their social memory or family memory of a thing that they are removed from, cut off from. There's a
Yeah.
really interesting thing, and I think you and I have talked about this a little bit in other contexts, where there was a kind of mourning and grieving from a lot of Irish people about their loved ones who never came back. And in a lot of cases, they wrote them off as dead. And
Mm,
so people carry the ghosts of that disconnection. And some people said, no, no, you're going to come back. You're going to come back. And they retained that family connection. And they're overjoyed when an American comes and says, yeah, my grandfather was this person.
mm.
You're one of us. I'm so glad. Because they'd never cut that tie. They'd
Yeah,
never cut that
it's
thread.
true. It's true. And
Um,
so, like, but what that means, and I think that, you know, when you in America, as a person of Irish descent and a kind of a culture bearer of Irish culture, right? You're performing another kind of sacred community role, which is it's to be there and to offer them that connection, and also to be the witness of their connections, like that they want to come and say, I'm Mary McCarthy and my family come from Cork, almost as if to ask for your blessing, you know,
yeah.
in your role as the priestess, right?
Mhm.
Um, and here's the thing, it just strikes me now because I was gonna start into telling you the same story I told you before, but like that happened to me one time just by going to a wedding, and I was Irish and it was in San Francisco, and all the Irish, it was a long distant family, all the old Irish people were coming up to me to tell me who they were and where they were from, just because I was Irish and I was from there.
Mhm.
Now, all the more it would be if you're doing this, you're performing and offering that culture. But it strikes me, sort of just as we speak, but people who sing seanos, people who and the seanachie, the people who tell the old stories, and the people who do the old ways, um, all of them are providing that, not
Mhm.
just to emigrants, because in a sense, like, I don't know, we're all disinherited emigrants from the past, you know? We're
Yeah.
all cast out. of this thing that was long ago. And when somebody like you offers us this music that has this kind of visceral effect on us, and I think part of that also is it seems to go beyond um, our conscious associations and our conscious knowledge of what the music is. It hits something deep in us that we feel like is atavistic. It goes back. It's somewhere in our cultural memory that is buried from our ancestors. And so again, you're providing a sense of kind of communion with the ancestors, because
I would say yes.
this is music that they listened to, and this is music that they made, and especially when you sing in Irish.
It's an interesting thing to be born here on Turtle Island, right? So-called United States, because I occupy neither a position of authority as a singer of the old traditions authentically in
Mm,
Ireland, nor do I occupy a fully American or Americanized indigenous space. I come as the result of emigration.
yeah.
And so it's kind of a third space to carry traditions, but not all of them and not quite enough of them
But
from each.
I guess what I'm saying is that nobody does, right? Like, yes, you're from an immigrant family, um, but in a weird way, we all are. Like modern
Yeah.
Irish people, we have left behind just as much in some ways as those who emigrated to America or wherever. I mean, some Irish Americans are much more adamant about conserving old traditions from Ireland than Irish people are. You know, they're much more into Irish dancing, or they're much more into, some types of folk and trad music or whatever. And I think some Irish people can be a bit mean about that, and they can kind of laugh and say, "Oh, look, plastic paddies, like with their green beer and St. Patrick's Day, like ridiculousness." But I say, no, no, look, this this is what happens when you transplant people, you know, and they are celebrating where they come from, and it should not be sneered at. And also, in a very, very practical way, tourism is our number one export. So, let's be real here. Like, these people are coming to our country and spending massive amounts of money. Um, Irish immigrants all over the world are the reason that we have more sort of artistic and geopolitical influence than we could possibly expect to as a tiny, insignificant country. Let's be let's be gracious about it. You know, um,
Mm.
but Irish people in Ireland, we also are exiles from our own past, and have, I think, also. So, I mean, some people have really kind of cut off from the past in Ireland on purpose, and sometimes it's because of quite traumatic reasons. Like, the country has been through a traumatic few centuries, and I think it's lovely. I mean, when did you last go back to Ireland?
I think the most recent was 2015.
Yeah,
So
I think that was already around then. I think in the last 20, 25 years, I think there's been a lovely kind of resurgence of celebration and pride in Ireland of ourselves, but in a modern way, like kind of reinventing the country in a way that is modern and open and brings forward things from the past.
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I left myself 20 years ago now, but I go back regularly. Um, and from my distance in mainland Europe, um, I see a country that's kind of coming into its own. Um, Things like the gay marriage referendum and the abortion referendum, showing that with the kind of campaigns that went on, that this is a modern country now. Um, and the sort of what I see about the way people talk about Irish culture and celebrate it in Ireland, and that they do it also still with a sense of humor, which is one of the best things about Irish culture, if you ask me.
I would agree with that. I think one of the things that did carry through as a thread from my father's family, and weird aside, it turns out my mother's family too, was the stories, and the stories about folklore and livelihood and personal experiences and anecdotes, lessons and children's books and things of the sort, a love of poetry. All of these things were my thread back to my family's cultures. And those were the things, and also food. Those were the things that were specifically retained and carried forward from my forebears.
Mm.
And a lot of that is functionally the lessons of why you pay attention and listen to your elders as much as you can, as best you can, and learn from everybody that you come across as a bearer of some kind of wisdom. And I think that's informed a lot of both my musical practice and my magical practice,
Mm.
so that I know the traditions from which I'm pulling the
Yeah,
thread that
yeah,
influence inspiration.
absolutely. And I think that those, you know, in a couple of my early episodes, I spent a lot of time talking about the function of myth and that idea that um, what these stories are for is exactly that. It's to tell us where we came from, who we are, and what we believe in, you know, and they provide, they carry our culture also, those stories. And they're so important. Um, do you think that your um, magical practice and artistic practice, um, do you see them as one thing or two things that feed into each other?
I'm not
Can
sure
you?
I have a clear answer to that.
Right.
I think as a single person, they're elements that feed and influence each other
Yeah.
necessarily.
Sure.
So I'm not sure I necessarily have a distinction. There are moments where my music, I don't talk about my pagan side. I don't talk about my magic or witchdom. Like it just never comes up in conversations when I'm singing Christmas songs at
Which,
churches. Like,
which is weird because Christmas songs are all about those things. Um,
yeah,
no, but
which is why I love them.
yeah, absolutely. But this is interesting. This is interesting. Well, let's talk about that now. Like in terms of identifying as a pagan, you talked about animism earlier. You talked about witchcraft. Like, is it important to you what words you use for yourself, or is it important to you to define what type of magical practice you have, or is it just something that's highly personal?
I think it's highly personal, and I think it's context specific.
Yeah.
You know, a church service, I'm going to talk about commonalities. I'm going to speak about or sing about the things that we all emotionally resonate with and
Yeah.
connect to. I'm not going to be fussed about the labels of this denomination or that title,
Yeah.
because I want it to be accessible.
I know what you mean, and I think that that's absolutely true. And also what you said earlier about the music, um, and I think, and for me, this is also why music is sort of almost the most powerful of the arts, is that it has that universal appeal. That there isn't really, obviously, different cultures have different musical vocabulary, but everybody can listen to music
Mhm.
and like get something. Like they might not get the same thing, but they can get something, you know? Um, and there is that universality to it. There's actually you probably know the quote, but I've cracked it out in several oral exams and always impressed people very much with it, in France at least, which is the idea that all art aspires to the condition of music, which is from Walter Pater. So that the way I understand that is that every other art, when it's doing its absolute best, is when it gets more musical, when it's becoming more like music, you know? And I think cool, right? But if that universality, accessibility, that sort of generosity that you bring to music, magic, on the other hand, the occult side of things, tends to work more by excluding and secrecy. Or does it? What do you think?
I think I hate heavy-handed art. I think I hate heavy-handed magic. I think I'm less moved and less able to just be swept away when it's telling me I'm going to sweep you away with this emotional riff of all minor chord. Like,
can you?
you
I love that, because I know what heavy-handed art is, but what's heavy-handed magic? I want to know.
Music is like, I mean, I don't want to trash on anybody's traditions, but like when it's all about the bells and whistles and showmanship and the flashy lights and sparkles, and then you miss all of the transformation that happens underneath it.
So, for example, when you are, and again, I'm not going to be sort of making any specific references, but if you are following a very long, complicated text, for example, in order to engage with a particular being, and it has to be done exactly this way, only this way, with exactly these clothes and exactly the, all these elements like lined up, totally the same. Yeah, well, that's the antithesis of what you talked about, the way of creating a song.
Right. And to be fair, I've been in trouble, quote unquote, with a lot of traditions for not having the rote memorization and having to look at the words because they're not my words and they don't feel right for my connection or conversation with this person. Like having a script is just not, like, if I understand why from a contextual perspective,
Sure.
then I can pull those ingredients in appropriate moments and quantities.
Right.
Whereas if it's always 42 candles leftwise to the sun, like, do birthday candles count? And can I put them in a Pyrex dish big enough to...
No, they have to be, absolutely, they have to be from the fat rendered from black goats. It's very specific. And the black goats must be virgins. Like, yeah, I know.
And it's cumbersome. It's totally cumbersome, I think. And sometimes there are reasons to have all of those touch points to focus on so that people can feel immersed in the thing.
Well, if I may,
stripping it back is better. Go ahead. Sorry.
I missed that. What was that?
I said I find stripping it back to what is actually essential is far more valuable.
Now, I mean, here's what I kind of think, because I think I very much am of the same predilection as you in that sense, and having a really good sense of the elements, the symbolic values of the elements, having ready some good forms of words, but then being able to weave it together depending on the moment and the feeling and the atmosphere, and having an improvisational element to it, and concentrating on the simplicity. However, I can also see the value in a big production. If you do have sort of awesome, like 5-foot tall red candles, and you've got like ceremonial robes and sort of holy silver dagger, whatever, it is cool. Like, it's theater, right? Like,
sure.
like yes, I mean, sets and costumes and lighting and a big production is really awesome. And if that's what you're trying to do, then great. But I almost would compare it to like that is opera, right? That is the magnum opera, the great work, where it is huge costumes and sets and music and orchestra and lights, and the whole shebang, and it's very elaborate, and it's very dramatic, and all of that stuff, which, you know, amazing. But that's very different from if what you're trying to do is sing a folk song in a pub.
Yes, and here's the thing about all of the trappings. Do they detract from one's experience with being moved, or do they add to it? And I find that for me, too much sensory input, like a giant action movie on the big screen, like the giant IMAX screens with the goggles and the chairs that tilt back and the dome views and the incredible bangs and whizzes and explosions and lightning and all of that stuff. When you then top it off with all of the rest of it, my disbelief is harder to suspend.
I mean, same, but I don't think that's the same for everyone. You know,
Cool.
I think some people really, really crave a totally immersive experience where they're like, where all the senses are engaged. And also, there is no doubt about this, doing something that is hard to set up requires a lot of discipline and effort, and putting a lot of discipline and effort into something has a visceral payoff, you know, for sure. I don't like hard work or effort or discipline, but that's just me. So when you talked about getting in trouble with various traditions, have you been a member of different traditions, and what kind of ones, or would you rather not talk about which ones in particular?
I've been a member of several groups, and they pull elements from various traditions, and some of them ecstatic and or initiatory traditions, and some of them less so. So there's a certain amount that I can't talk about. But I find that it's about working styles. And it's about what works well for people and what creates, like for group ritual, you want to be on the same page, or at least a similar page enough to be pulling in that same direction with the other people. I find, though, when people are so busy staring at their books and getting the words right, or struggling to remember the right sequence of phrases with the left hand and the bells and whistles, like, because they're not in the immersive experience, it's an awful lot harder for them to bring everybody else along.
I agree. And
I see that a lot.
It's actually quite hard, to be honest. I think it's quite hard to find a group of people where you are all enough on the same page that you're going to, I don't know. I mean, I sort of, in some ways, I sort of yearn for that experience, having only had it a few times, of working with groups and ceremonial stuff. But like, I look around and I'm just kind of like Groucho Marx about it, you know. I wouldn't really want to join any group that would actually have me as a member. I don't know. I just I feel like at the end of the day, groups and lodges and orders and covens and all of these things, they could be great if only it weren't for people. You know?
Yeah. I mean, the liturgy and the rote memorization and the number of candles and the whatever is just about, like, for me, my understanding of it is that that's about getting people on the same page. And it's about having a thing to fall back on that's in common. If you're singing a song with a group chorus and everybody's got slightly different versions or verses or words for the song, it's just not as clean. It's not as clear. It's not as precise. It's not as practiced. It's not as cohesive. And it kind of fuzzes at the edges. So maybe
Yeah.
it's not as potent.
Yeah.
But
I agree.
I'm averse to the trappings for the sake of trappings.
Yeah.
I think that's where my magical and spiritual traditions, where I get in trouble with people. Like, because so and so said so is just not a good enough reason.
Well, I think I very much agree. I very much agree. Now, having said that, right? Talking about the sort of the role of groups and so on. What about I think this is something that we've touched on already, but let's maybe just make it a bit more explicit. What is the role of the magician and the artist in society? I mean, you've already talked about the way the artist can sort of serve community and almost lead community in sacred experiences. But what about the magician? Do they have a responsibility or a duty or a role? Or is it just something people do, on their own in their garage in the evenings?
The tradition for which I held an ordination sort of title or something,
Right.
as a part of stepping into ordination, requires an oath of service.
To whom?
It's ambiguous, which is fun, right?
I love ambiguity.
Mm. And part of that oath of service is stepping outside of it's about me and my internal process. It has to involve other people. If you're going to be ordained, you have to know how to work with and bring people into magic with you.
Yeah.
And help them be moved and transformed by magic with you. It's a role rather than a top marks on my graduation page.
Yeah. Gotcha. Now, the thing is though, like, and you even refer to that as ordination. Isn't that just religion though? Like at that point, doesn't it cross the line into being religion? Because I wonder about if you have an organization and they are doing something spiritual, and especially if they have a hierarchy, isn't there an argument that that then is a religious community, whereas magic is something that you do? It's a practice. It's the actual doing of it. Whereas all that organization stuff and all that like ordinations and initiations and et cetera, that's religious stuff.
Yes, and I think for many people, they each can be both.
Oh yeah. I mean, I agree, but I think
I
that
mean, as a polytheist, my religion is fairly unhierarchical. So despite ordination, it's not about a hierarchy of levels or something. The function of ordination is, do you have the tools to be able to be called in to do certain kinds of service for community, of weddings and funerals and coming of age ceremonies,
at
and
that point
like,
you become a minister,
yeah.
yes, a servant, but a community leader. And as soon as some people are ordained and others aren't, you've got hierarchy.
Mm.
I mean, you know,
I think ultimately my tradition had left with everybody who wanted to be ordained having gone through figuring out how to do stuff and got ordained, which is to say everybody but one who was like, I don't want to commit to being of service. I like my internal process. And we still call on her for whatever
yeah.
she's up for, right?
I mean, I think that's also interesting because I think that possibly there's this idea that um, you know, there's a possibility, and it doesn't exist very widely, but for pagan congregations, like for actual, pagan ceremony, worship, sacrament, etc., to happen, where you've got the people who are like what we would call the practitioners, but who are the ordained, and then
Mhm.
you've got, you know, the community who just like, they just believe in it. They're not like out there doing it all the time. It's not their role. But then, you know, I mean, it raises a whole lot of other questions. But I do think it's fascinating. However, let me ask you this. It's one thing to consider what we might do to serve our community in their spiritual well-being, in their material well-being, in their emotional well-being, all this stuff. What do we do to serve our communities as artists, magicians, witches, in the face of the end of the world?
We share our art.
Yeah, what do we do now?
We share it.
Hmm.
Don't hold it just for ourselves internally as only a think piece. We talk about it to people. We show it to people. We play it for people. We involve other people in the art.
Good. And ditto with magic?
Ditto with magic.
Do we have a duty these days to share that with more people than we previously have?
I think as with Shanno singing, in the right context, heck yeah. Choose the right moment for the right magic or the right song.
Yes. Because I think so. Because I think that art, music is one of the things that gives me hope and it gives people hope. And I think that magic is another thing that gives me hope and gives me comfort. And I think that where it used to be something that I and many other people would be quite diffident about, we're not going to go around announcing it, right? But as you say, I mean, I'm not going to walk into the supermarket and say, I'm a magician and I need some eggs. I mean, I might.
You might, yeah.
I might, but
now that I think about it.
But, I love what you just said. Like a Shanno song, you don't start up talking about the old ways, just any old moment, but you pick the moment. And it doesn't have to be a moment that's perfect, but it has to be a moment that has potential to open that experience to others.
Yeah.
And that when you offer it, they will need to make the effort. Like they will need to listen and give you that attention, give it that attention. But I think it is one of the things we can do. Absolutely.
I agree. I like that. That's lovely. And I think sharing it with one another is that first step to providing the opportunity to make bigger magic and bigger transformation, right? If I'm singing to myself in my shower, and I do that every single time because I'm me. That's just like my days are filled with mute. That's how I warm up. That's how I walk around the house. That's how I do laundry. Like I sing as I do these things. But if I'm doing all of those things by myself, maybe they only have a chance to transform me and that's enough. But I find that bigger magic is possible when you do involve anybody else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I think that from where the very place that we started this conversation, where you talked about your conception of it as being dialogue, as being sharing, as being connection. All of those things are all very well. And I think that they can be wonderful on your own. But it's kind of selfish though, you know? And as you say, how could it possibly reach its full potential without becoming interpersonal, without becoming relational, you know?
Yeah. It necessarily, I do want to place a caveat within this. That is that it's not always going to be the right audience. You're going to have chosen moments that other people can't and won't want to meet you in.
No.
That's all part of it too. but it doesn't make the magic any less worthwhile or the music any less worthwhile.
And you must, I suppose, have the courage to persist when you should and the discretion to stop when you need to, like, we don't want to get anyone lynched. But it's I think that having that idea that both these things, art and magic, music, poetry, enchantment, I think all of them are worth being generous with. And they only get better by being shared.
Hear, hear. Here's the last of my tea here. Hear, hear.
Well, there you go. I think that's a lovely moment to end on. Thank you so much for this lovely conversation. And I look forward to talking to you again very soon. Thank you for being an inspiring and enchanting guest this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for hosting me and inviting me to be a part.
Now, peace. Charms wound up.
We'll sing out from treetops, from rooftops and cars, from buses and trolleys, and looking at stars. When we join in a chorus of birds taking flight, we know that the skyline and future looks bright. There's a rage that's been growing and it aches in my heart. But we're not through with loving, everyone's got a part. There's a tale that needs telling, and I'm not alone. I'll sing out the joys for those left when we're gone. We're blue ones and green ones, there's black, grey and brown. We're old ones and new ones, some quiet, some loud. The rainbow of all birds is a beautiful sight. Our song fills the air when we shake off the night. We'll sing and remember when we're old, worn and tired. Our heroes have long gone, they've gloried and admired. What we have together is a chance to make bright a chorus together when we rise and take flight. So sing what's inside us and remind of what's true. It's constant and turning and helps us get through. The struggles before us are small when compared to birds all together taking flight till we're there. The struggles before us are small when compared to birds all together taking flight till we're